But I don't know if you did your homework or not. Psalm 16 is where we are. Psalm 16. To do a call on Tuesday night. All right. Just if anyone did look ahead, did do anything, or even if you didn't, you could probably answer a couple questions. Who wrote the psalm? David. Very good. That was an easy one, right? What's a michtam?
16.
Psalm 16. What's a michtam? Because it's a michtam of David. Well, I looked it up.
Give us a definition.
And it's a term of unknown origin. so apparently nobody knows at this point.
It's not a Hebrew word?
Well, it's a Hebrew word, but they talked about the root of it, but they just don't know some technical term, they said. And it is true that in many of the Psalms you have certain words up there that have to do with directors to the musicians. You know, so if a choir is singing it or something, there's something about it. Some believe it might be a kind of a poem, which the Psalms are. But anyhow, that's the introduction to this. But as we look at this psalm, did anyone find out where this is quoted, that we know it's a messianic psalm? How do we know it's a messianic psalm? Rebecca?
Verse 10.
Pardon?
Verse 10.
No. Yes, but how do we know that is messianic?
Because verse 10 is in some other part of the Bible.
Yes, that's what I was asking.
But I don't know where.
Anybody find out where it was? Yes.
Because it talks about Christ and about that we have like.
Where though?
There, I highlighted in my Bible. I go back to my Bible because
I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just want to generate conversation.
Go to my online Bible because I highlighted and I read that today.
Jeff, did you raise your hand?
I have a guess, but I don't think it's right. Did Peter mention it?
Yes, Peter mentioned it in Acts when he was preaching.
I forgot to do my homework, so I wasn't confident.
Yeah.
I highlighted several of like verse 5 and verse 10, 11, that for you will not leave my soul in Sheol.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's found in the book of Acts.
My Schofield notes say Acts 2.
Yes. Let's turn together to Acts. Well, let's read this first. Therefore, verse 8. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will rest in hope, for you will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Now, having read that, let's turn to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, this is Peter preaching to the Jewish audience on the day of Pentecost. Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 25. For David says concerning him, he's preaching Jesus. For David says concerning him, I foresaw the Lord always before my face. And then just what we read is repeated here about how verse 27 will not leave my soul in Hades. And you remember from previous study in Sunday school, Sheol and Hades, Hebrew, Greek, same thing, place of the departed dead. Nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. So Peter preaching is telling us that Psalm 16 is messianic. And he makes the point this way. Let's look at the context here in the book of Acts. What is Peter preaching in verses 22 to 24? The resurrection of Christ, that's right. He preached, basically he's preaching the gospel, right? He says, you delivered him, he was crucified, you put him to death, but God raised him, having loosed the pains of death because it was not possible that he should be held by it. Then he quotes that psalm. So now, what is Peter's argument? He says that God raised Jesus from the dead. He quotes this psalm. Then look at verse 9. He goes on to explain it or expound on it. And what's his point? It's a psalm of David. And David said this, but what's his point? In verses 29 and 30 and 31. Yes.
That like corruption means like decay and stuff. So David decayed, so it couldn't have been talking about him, but Jesus was raised again because.
That's exactly right. So that's the point he makes. He says, here's what David said, but David saw corruption. His tomb is still here. But we're proclaiming Jesus, and we're proclaiming he's not still here. He was raised from the dead. That's the message that was being spread. And it is true of Jesus then, in verse 30. Therefore, being a prophet, so David's a prophet. That's why we have his writings in our Bibles. And knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his body, that is, David was promised that a descendant of his, according to the flesh, he would raise up the Christ to sit on David's throne, his throne. He, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses, and so forth. So, this is clearly a messianic psalm. It is clearly a prophetic psalm. The prophet David, foreseeing the resurrection of Christ under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, penned these words. Now let's go back to Psalm 16, and we'll just focus on a couple matters tonight by way of personal application. As I've said often, many people find comfort in the Psalms because the psalmist writes about experiences similar to what we go through today. That's why they touch our heart, because he said, David, you went through stuff and I'm going through stuff. I don't say stuff, but anyhow, that's the word of this generation, I think, stuff, you know. Yeah. I know Bob Peterson, when he taught history, he didn't like it when students answered questions like Christopher Columbus discovered America and stuff. You know? Now the Pilgrims, they came to America and stuff. They stuffed themselves with turkey and stuffing. Yeah, stuff.
After they starved.
Well, to be fair, they did discover stuff.
But anyhow, so what many commentators have said, and I believe this is the case because this is true of all Scripture, is these Psalms do express their own experience. But very often then they're lifted above that experience to foretell the future. And so verses 1 through 8 can apply to David. But Peter told us the rest doesn't apply to David because David's dead. He hasn't been raised. He saw corruption. His body went back to the dust. So others see in this, and I believe this is a valid point, is that verses 1 to 8 can be applied to Jesus. Verses 9 through 11 do apply to Jesus. Because if you think of Jesus' relationship with his Father when he became man, was he was in situations where he was pursued by the enemies. They wanted to stone him on several occasions. And so, preserve me, O God, for in you I put my trust. Jesus did trust in his Father. O my soul, you have said to the Lord, you are my Lord. My goodness is nothing apart from you. As for the saints who are on the earth, that's believers, they are the excellent one in whom is all my delight. And, you know, Jesus takes delight in those who follow him and those who believe on him. How do we know he took delight in it? Well, two ways. In Hebrews chapter 12, it says, Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross and despised the shame. That's because of believers that he was going to bring with him. And we all know John 14, 1 to 3. Where did he go? What's he doing? Preparing a place. And why is he preparing a place for us? He's going to come back for us, and what does he want? I'll come back and receive you unto myself, that where I am, you may be also. That's his desire. He delights in those who belong to the Lord. So he says, the excellent ones in whom is all my delight. And so, if you think of it from an earthly perspective or a non-Jesus perspective, so to speak, that happens with believers. You know, we sing a song, I'm so glad I'm a part of the family of God. And I'm sure you've all experienced, you go somewhere where there are other believers and you kind of just mesh right away. You delight in that. You find something in that you don't find in other groups. You can be friends with other people and so forth, but it's like you're part of a family when you get together with believers. And that's why God established the local church, because believers need believers to fellowship, to encourage, and just to pray and rejoice together. And so these things apply to David, applies to us, but it applies to the Lord as well. Verse 5, he says, O Lord, you are the portion of my inheritance. Jesus as man is speaking to God, and God is his portion, Jehovah. The lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Yes, I have a good inheritance. The idea of the lines there think of it in terms of boundaries. The property you staked out for me is good property. Well, Jesus is inheriting the earth, and we who know him are going to inherit the earth with him. We have that blessed hope as well. And so he says in verse 7, I will bless the Lord who has given me counsel. My heart also instructs me in the night seasons. I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. And that's the place we want to be as believers. You know, we live in a troubled, wicked world. But we set the Lord before us. And he is the one that sustains us, keeps us, and protects us. And that's what another psalm says. The angel of the Lord encamps round about those who fear him. So we have that wall of protection. We're in enemy territory, but we have soldiers, angelic beings, that are our protection and protect and keep us from Satan's attacks or other things that might happen. Remember, go to the book of Job no, don't turn there, but just think of the story of Job when Satan is conversing with God, and he says he's only serving you because you've given him so much. And he said, and then he asked permission. He says, you let me take his stuff. We're back to stuff. You let me take his stuff away, he'll think you'll see differently. Now, Satan was wrong, but you see, he couldn't take his stuff unless God opened a place for Satan to come in and do those things. And that's hard to grasp as a believer, I think, because we don't see these things going on. But what I mean by that is when something happens to us that we view as negative. We don't generally think about it as the fact, well, God just opened the door for that to happen. He's allowed it to happen for our good. As we said Sunday morning, He's conforming us to the image of His Son, so He has a purpose in what He allows. It's not just arbitrary. And, it's a blessing to know, just like we haven't evolved by chance, we were created by God's design. And so as our lives unfold, we're not given to time and chance. God is directing. So the one who knows how many hairs we have, the one who doesn't allow a sparrow to fall without His intervention. Isn't that amazing to think about God that way? I can't imagine. I have trouble keeping the few things I have to do in order. And the fact that every minute detail is just, He takes care of it. It's an amazing thing. And so, set the Lord before us. And because He's at my right hand, I will not be moved. He's the one that upholds us. And when we go through difficult times, we can rest in hope. And while this is speaking of Jesus Christ, it is also true, though, that when we lay aside this outward body, there's coming a time when we'll get it renewed. And in the meantime, as we've studied in Sunday school, we're going to be in the Lord's presence. So let's just focus on God's sovereignty. Set the Lord before you, recognizing that He's the gatekeeper of whatever occurs in my life. And I always tremble when I preach this, because then God's going to see whether I believe that or not. Put me to the test. Yeah. I know one time I had preached, not this sermon, but preached along those lines, and we were at church, and then we got home, and my children were coming in a different car a little later, and then I get a call that they'd been in an accident. And I thought, oh my, it's putting the test. Well, long story short, no one was seriously hurt. They ran into a Corvette. And the guy that had the Corvette, he was taking it down to Smithville to keep it there while he was going to be away to protect it. And we did a number on that. And then, of course, that car hit the car in front of them. And I thought we'd for sure get a lawsuit from the Corvette. We never heard from him again. But the car in front that hardly got damaged, that's the one that got a lawsuit, which was turned down, by the way, because it was frivolous, and they were just trying to get money that they. But thankfully,
The lawyer that fled to Mexico. It was a lawyer that was a
yeah, the lawyer that represented him was for corruption or whatever, fled to Mexico eventually. But anyhow, I'm just thankful the insurance lawyers took care of all that. But set the Lord before us always, because He is the keeper that protects our life and directs our steps. So let's carry that with us. And I went longer than I thought I was going to, but that's all right. We were encouraged, that's good. But we will sing a couple songs. So